Welcome to Voices in the Wilderness, conversations about church and leader health. Thank you so much for listening. We encourage you to keep the conversation going. Voices in the Wilderness is brought to you by Preparing for Amazement Ministries, where we empower and equip churches and leaders to create lasting and transformational health. Visit amazed15.org to learn more. We also welcome any comments or suggestions. Simply email us at podcast@amazed15.org. My name is Marcus Carlson, and today our guest is David Wolverton. Welcome, David.
Good to be here, my friend. Good to be here.
Well, so for the next several podcasts, we started last episode, but we're walking through the habits of healthy churches, kind of taking one habit for each podcast episode. And so today we are looking at habit 2, healthy churches do conflict well. And I thought it'd be great to talk to you about that. So maybe before we kind of dive in, could you share a little bit about you and your ministry experience, especially around conflict?
Sure. I think the best way to introduce me to your listening audience is to first say I am a child of God for sure. But I learned most about conflict by getting married.
Amen.
But
I'm still learning mostly
everything,
that way.
yeah, right. Everything that I ever learned about myself that was negative, I learned from being married. But I also learned an incredible amount of grace from my wife, who looks at all of my faults and all of my issues and loves me unconditionally.
Mm.
At least that's what she tells me. But all good. No, I am my full-time job is I'm a pastor. I've been in full-time local church ministry as a pastor for 38 years. It feels longer many times, and other times it feels shorter. But in addition to that, I am also part-time as a faculty mentor and affiliate professor at Kairos University, where I met you. And I also do some leadership and clergy coaching as a sidebar. I'm a mentor to a number of different clergy persons in active ministry.
Mm.
I'm an author. I have written 2 books to date. The first is called Mission Rift Leading Through Church Conflict, and the other is called Profit and Loss, uh, embracing grief, nurturing resilience, and harnessing authentic leadership. I absolutely love writing, but more importantly, everything that I've ever learned, I like giving it away. I love seeing that wonderful aha moment in the eyes and ears of our colleagues in ministry, because I love equipping other pastors. In addition to that, I have a doctorate in conflict leadership. Got that over time, and I've done extensive clinical work in hospital chaplaincy, focusing in
Mm.
on emergency room and trauma care, as well as I spent quite a bit of time doing what now would be called AIDS and HIV hospice care. Back then,
Cool.
when I started doing that, AIDS was very new, HIV was very new, it was still very unknown and prevalent. It was growing, and we didn't know anything about it. But I was blessed and challenged to be in the midst of all of that in the mid 1980s, holding the hands of individuals as they were dying of
Mm.
this virus that was taking us by storm, and learned a ton about conflict, standing in the midst of that, because the majority of the people that were dealing with HIV at the time were dealing with also the relational dynamics and all of the stigma that was attached to it, and the family issues that were prevalent as the contexts of how they obtained HIV were brought to light. I mean, so that was part of how I got into the realm of conflict as a discipline. I also had experiences back in college of leading. I was the president of our Christian fellowship group, and uh, back then it was the issues totally hypothetical in our culture today, but it was the issues of conservative theology versus progressive theology going head to head, and I was smack dab in the middle of it.
I'm
And the
glad we've gotten over
progressives,
that, by the way.
yeah, I'm so thrilled that we have moved beyond it. But I was smack dab in the middle of it, and the progressive voices were my advisors, the faculty at the college, and they influenced my ordination journey by saying things like, "Well, David has a difficult time dealing with conflict," but none of them, this is the hook. None of them, as faculty, ever said we need to teach David how to deal with conflict.
Mm.
So they all just evaluated me, and so out of frustration, and then going into being assigned to a church that was rapidly growing, we grew from 300 in worship to 2,000 in worship over the span of a decade, and the dynamics of all of what was involved with that. I learned about conflict in the trenches, and it's because I sought out further education, and that further education ultimately led me to pursuing a doctorate, got the doctorate, and because I had special training in conflict, I got pegged as the conflict guy, and I was sent to churches that were dealing with conflict, and that's my story in a nutshell.
Yeah, getting pegged as the conflict, I mean, that does not sound much like fun to me. Does not sound like fun to me at all. Uh, but I also know from my own experience that, it's part of the deal, and it's part of kind of what I've experienced. And since you got the doctorate, you've mastered marital conflict, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mastered the ability to stir up conflict in marriage. That's
Well,
who
I've been
that's who
called a
we are.
pot stirrer more than once in my life, sometimes multiple
Yeah.
times in a day. So it's a genetic condition that I come by honestly. So, as you've done all this work around conflict, how have you seen conflict cause harm in churches?
Yeah, that's a really great question. If I could, I could probably, and with the risk of being reductionistic, I could whittle conflict in churches down to two forms: conflict that harms or kills, or conflict that cultivates growth.
Mm,
And of the conflict that kills or harms, I have seen benign situations, little tiny things that suddenly become massive mountains because of how they have been left to fester.
mm,
And I've also seen um, good conflict go bad when it has just been handled inappropriately or out of fear or anxiety. So I've also seen control-based situations where anxiety rides high, and a leader may initiate some change, a dramatic change, or even a subtle change, and it causes anxiety among some of the parishioners, and so they start reacting, and their reactions are based on anxiety, so they try to control the situation by controlling those who are making the decisions. I've also seen where the conflict erupts in a negative way because of power groups. What we call in family systems, we call them closed power systems. Those systems or those groups that could be mom and pop. These family dynamics that are infiltrating small or medium or even larger churches where they have all of the control, and nothing happens in ministry without Aunt Sarah or Uncle Jack giving the nod to this. And when they don't give the nod, no matter who initiates the change, they are challenged and confronted, and you know, all of the decisions that are made uh, get filtered into a negative bin. Unfortunately, I've seen so many pastors who come in, especially young pastors, with a vibrant mentality, a real vision for that local church, who get chewed up, spit out, and even leave ministry because of this kind of a closed power system. I've also seen how some mental health issues may influence
mm,
the culture of a local church. This is not to say that mental health is a precursor to conflict. It is to say that some conflicts can trace themselves to individuals who are dealing with mental health issues. Like I personally had to deal with a situation where an individual who had a diagnosis of bipolar. Again, I know there's a lot of individuals who deal with that diagnosis, but this person actually created a storyline against the pastor that was false. And she convinced other individuals within the church that this pastor did some things. And it later got exposed that she made it all up. So sometimes conflict can become divisive, rooted in some mental health issues. And then finally, actually, it's not finally, but another category that I have seen is genuine. I don't have another way of putting it other than there are genuinely evil people out there that just want to go in, infiltrate into the leadership of the church. They look spiritual, and their goal is to undermine everything that is good, and destroy the church. And so, all of those things I have seen in terms of conflicts that hurt, harm, or even kill. There's one more, if I could take just a moment. It
Yeah.
is subtle. It is subtle, but I've seen it time and time again. And I know, Carl, Marcus, you have also seen this. It is when pastors or leaders get so overwhelmed with their sense of who they are in the midst of a growing organization that they will self sabotage and have an affair or develop a DUI or use their church computer to access porn, and it's all subtly to get exposed to because it's easier to exit a situation with one of those explainable things than to admit that I'm beyond my capacity to lead in this present context. So I've seen all of those kind of
Mm.
conflicts destroy churches.
Yeah, that last one is very insightful because I know certainly I've seen, a few of those experiences, and of course, where there are people, there is conflict, and and I've seen some conflicts. You talked about, one being, destructive and one being informative, and I've seen the same conflict spend a season in each, right? That
Yeah,
sometimes it's the way that we handle it, and of course I've been really passionate about, Jesus's instructions in Matthew 18. But for you, in your experience, like how can churches do conflict well so that it doesn't have to cause harm? Like if we know it's going to happen, like what from your experience, if healthy churches do conflict well, what can churches do it well so it doesn't have to cause so much harm?
yeah, another great question. So, step number one, I would say to any leader or any pastor who's facing into creating an environment where we can demythologize conflict and also deconstruct how conflict is bad is number one, just breathe. Breathe first. We have to lower our own anxiety so that uh, not completely get rid of it. We want to lower it to a simmer level and get to a place where we look at conflict differently. We want, as leaders, we want to initiate the appropriate change for discipleship to happen individually and corporately for our churches and organizations. We want that. So, a general rule that I have is that if you are doing your job well as a leader and you are initiating appropriate change, there will be conflict. So, if there's an absence of conflict in your church organization, that's where you should be worried about. Because if there's no conflict, we have to ask ourselves: Are we asking people of faith to do anything? Are
Mhm.
we asking them to engage mission? Are we? And if not, we may preserve peace and end up dying on the
Yeah.
vine because we're not engaging the mission that God has called us to do. And so, my philosophy on the get go is churches and leaders, we need to develop a different way of thinking about conflict. And number one, I think our goal has to change. In the olden days, our goal, even when I was taking my doctoral work was in conflict management. I was the one who retooled that with my advisor in seminary. I was like, I don't think we want to manage conflict. Why? Because our goal is not to manage conflict. Our goal is to equip systems and people to be kingdom minded and mission focused. So really, we want to lead conflict. We don't want to be caught with our pants down, proverbially speaking, when conflict occurs. We want to be able to lead into it with expectation and anticipation that if we're doing our job right, we're going to initiate conflict. And so there are times when we have to think differently about it. Rather than avoiding conflict, we need to create environments where discipleship is to the forefront.
Yeah. Yes.
So that would be my number one go-to. Um, the second thing that I would say is leaders and this has really been helpful for me personally over the years, is that we have to think mosaically
Mm.
rather than linearly.
Say more about
So
mosaic for people that may not understand that kind of concept.
Sure. If those of you who are watching, if you don't know what a mosaic is, check out, Google mosaics and Byzantine artwork. Basically, it's the combination of a whole bunch of little tiles that are put together to create an image or a picture. It's an art form. It's beautiful. So my philosophy is both life and specifically conflict and other facets of life are best viewed mosaically.
Mm.
Now, what do I mean by that? Mosaics really depict their image artistically the further back you are. So if you're up close, you tend to see the individual tiles and
Mm.
the specifics of that tile. And you may or may not be able to see how that individual tile is connected to other tiles. And so the further back that you can get to view the larger image that's being presented, the more you will see the big picture. And so if we view conflict mosaically rather than from the perspective of the individual tile, we will begin to see how this conflict is actually part of a discipleship process that can be harnessed and used by God through the power of the Holy Spirit at work, because we anticipate that the Holy Spirit is present, can be used to help move this organization called the Church of Jesus Christ forward in their process of living missionally. So, unfortunately, what happens is that when we're faced in a stressful situation, we narrow our view and we go to the individual tile, and that tile tells a story. And the story is really important. But if we don't see how that story is part of a larger story, is connected to other parts of that story, we will fail to see how God has called us to be a part of something here and now that is actually leading us to connect with God's greater mission and plan that's bigger than us. That's mosaic thinking. And if we have that, if we can adapt our minds to mosaic thinking, then we're less anxious, less, not completely gone, but less anxious facing into a conflict situation because we know we're starting to ask different questions. Like question number one, why is this happening?
Hmm.
And why is this happening now? Those two questions begin to help move us to a place of going back so we can see a larger mosaic view of the situation that we're facing into. I could go on, but that's what I mean by mosaic thinking.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's that bigger perspective. To your first point, I often will tell churches, if less than 10% of your people are mad at any given time, you're probably not doing anything. But if
Right.
more than 20% of your people are mad at any given time, you're either not listening or not communicating well. That I think there is this tension, and we assume that, we would never say this out loud, but I think we assume discipleship's about comfort when it's about the exact opposite. And,
Yeah.
how do we stretch and change and challenge people? And I love your image of the mosaic. When I was studying change management, when I was doing my doctorate, we read a lot of Heifetz's work on adaptive leadership. And,
Yep.
he talks about getting on the balcony, right? Like if you imagine a dance floor, you've got to get up on the balcony and see the bigger picture. And so, I think of that mosaic and stepping back. But one of the things, listening to Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History, years ago, he talked about the Jesuits and their kind of philosophy of descending into the particulars. And so I think sometimes, especially in a conflict situation, you got to be able to do both, right? Like you've got to be able to get on the balcony and descend to the particulars. You've got to be able to look at the mosaic at a distance. You've got to be able to look at the mosaic, up close.
Yeah, Ignatius, you talk about the Jesuits. Ignatian theory is Ignatius talked a lot about consolation and disconsolation.
Yep.
And the disconsolation, we don't want to go into the disconsolation. Our nature is not to go into the dark side. We want to stay in the hope. We want to, but his view, which I absolutely love from a spiritual formation perspective, is that when you face into the disconsolation, God is actually using that to equip you to handle the spiritual warfare that's yet to come.
Mm. I mean, I've learned more in failure and conflict than I ever could have in a class or reading a book or by my successes, not just in ministry, but as you referenced in the beginning, marriage and
Yeah,
parenting and all of those things. And I think sometimes in the church, at least in my experience, the way that we really do conflict poorly, first and foremost, is just avoiding and ignoring it together. And we think it's Christian to, it's the kind of nice Christianity is what I call it. It's not nice to have
right,
conflict, so we'll ignore it or avoid it. But meanwhile, it's either stewing or we're gossiping about it, and the person, who's hurt us may not even know they have, and
right.
here we've missed an opportunity to grow ourselves and to help them grow. For sure. And I think, one of my kind of mentors in the consulting world, Pat Lencioni, he talks about tell the kind truth, right? That to not deal with it is actually one of the most hurtful things you can do to another person.
Yeah, Pat's spot on. He's spot on with that. The other thing that I would also recommend as we move to creating environments for healthier conflict scenarios is I think we have to dismantle this the predecessor environments of dishonor. The
Mm,
cultures of dishonor, I really think, undermine what God is trying to birth through us. Gossip that becomes prevalent, that those are dismantling um, in the culture of what God is trying to birth within the body of Christ. And also something that is controversial, I recommend that we also dismantle that culture of a pastor-centered ministry model.
yes,
That ministry doesn't happen unless the pastor, or in some cases for larger churches, the senior pastor is not doing it.
right.
So that's not biblical. I mean, the framework of what Martin Luther brought to the table of discussion that ultimately got him excommunicated is there is a priesthood of all believers, and we need to recognize that every individual has a role to play in God's kingdom building. And so when we think that the pastor is the center, we actually dishonor the larger framework of what God has established with the church. And then there's the legacy of hidden sin. In my other book, the Prophet and Lost book, I talk a little bit about these environments and the proactive side of what you asked about. I think we can delve into this by, as leaders, getting to the place where we do everything that we're asking our churches to do. We do for ourselves first. So
Yes,
we look at our own relationship with God. We look at our own legacies of hidden sin. We look at our own limitations. We look at our own grief. Grief is the underlying issue that most people in conflict situations fail to look at as a possible source. Both the leaders or pastors, as well as unspoken or undealt with, unresolved grief within the life of the congregation.
yeah. And I mean, I don't like asking people to do stuff unless I've done it myself or am willing to do it. because I think that, even if I'm not good at it, right? And I think a lot of times, we expect things of others that we don't, expect of ourselves. And I say all the time, I'm a hypocrite enough on accident. I don't want to be one on purpose, right? And so,
Yeah,
and so it's hard, because if you start talking about certain things, you got to check yourself first. I even have said in the middle of sermons, listen, I'm really just up here preaching to myself and you all get to watch, right? Because I
right.
think
That's
that
exactly right.
it does start there. And I was listening to a book about self-deception for leaders. And the big premise was you've got to see it as your problem first, not as
Right.
somebody else's problem. And I think that kind of humility is huge. And so this is great stuff, David. I mean, like, I appreciate you coming on and appreciate your heart for conflict. I feel like we could do a million episodes on conflict. It's
Yeah. Amen.
the reality in the churches, and I don't think anything's killing churches more than poorly handled or ignored conflict. And so appreciate your work in that and in your conversation today.
Ditto, man. Ditto, man. I really appreciate all of what you're doing here, especially with these habits. And any way that I can support you, I'm glad to do it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. We encourage you to keep the conversation going. Voices in the Wilderness is brought to you by Preparing for Amazement Ministries, where we empower and equip churches and leaders to create lasting and transformational health. Visit amazed15.org to learn more. And again, we welcome any comments or suggestions for topics or guests. Simply email us at podcast@amazed15.org.